Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. I told Dr. Melanie Matheu that I was just going to call her Melanie so that I would not be so intimidated, knowing that she prints tissue and organs for a living. So from here on, I'm going to call her Dr. Melanie. So thank you. Happy International Women's Day, everybody.
Yeah.
We're about to have a great conversation about how we can support women in leadership roles, especially in the health and sciences field. And I'm really fascinated to hear about your personal journey and how you started Prellis Biologics. But what we wanted to do is, because I know your time is valuable, it's been a long day, we wanted to set an intention for this conversation so that you know exactly what you're walking away with. So I'm going to let you begin.
Oh, right. So,
yes.
yeah. So,
and take it away.
There we go. So, so my intention for this is that everyone can hopefully learn from my experience. Everyone here has a unique experience, and hopefully something I say or something I've done or gone through or have a perspective on is something you can take home and apply in your own life.
Coincidence, my intention is similar. Every time I host these conversations, I always feel like, you get wrapped up in the excitement, but what are we doing after the conversation? So my intention is always that you'll take away a nugget or a piece of the story and let it ripple within your own networks and in your own community. So that's my intention. So let's begin the conversation. I want to start with your own personal journey into this field and starting the company, but also sharing some of the wow factors of what you do.
So I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in physiology and biophysics, and I was firmly on an academic track most of my life. And I started to kind of get pulled away in thinking about 3D printing and what that means. I was a physiologist. I was studying the immune system and immune reactions throughout the body. And that kind of idea kept tugging at me, though, like maybe we could do something here with tissue engineering with some of the technology I used.
Something that never comes up for me, but
yeah,
okay.
yeah, it was just kind of on the shelf of ideas,
Yes.
but it seemed like an important one and a really valuable one. And so I had this kind of fork in the road that was very distinct. Very few times in your life do you have a distinct choice, and I did. I was awarded an academic grant to go on and become a professor, and less than 24 hours later, I had an offer to become a director at a startup. And so, so it took me about a week to decide. I called everyone I knew, my old PIs, my friends who had gone into academia or industry, and I ended up deciding on one small thing, and that was that it was time for me to learn something new. I could clearly write a grant, get it funded. Okay, do I want to keep doing that for the rest of my life, next 20 years? No, I've got this idea in the back. Maybe I'll just kind of see what a startup is all about. And it was a big risk. It was a big leap. Yeah.
And you talk about that moment when you sort of, forked towards that path less traveled. Were you influenced by a particular piece of advice? I'm always curious about what makes a person take that final step, that leap.
Yeah. I've always been driven by learning, and so to me that seemed just kind of like an exciting, brave new world. I also had that idea on the shelf, that idea that if we could reverse engineer the way these imaging lasers worked, we could actually build the blood vessels and capillaries that are the building blocks for all of human tissue. And it's been known for a long time in tissue engineering. Sure, we've got like an ear or a nose on a dish, but that's not meaningful tissue. Yeah. That's not a liver, it's not a lung, it's not a kidney. I mean, it's meaningful. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. These are meaningful tissues to some people who need them, but it's not going to save your life in the end. And so this idea was something that was always in the background, and I kind of just took a leap. Yeah.
So now let's talk about, you've taken the leap. Let's talk about what you're actually building.
Right.
Sort of the wow factors of the company. I mean, it says a lot, like that in 2019 we're like, oh yeah, okay, you're printing organs with with a machine. Like, that's something that we do now.
Yeah.
But it really, I always remind myself not to lose that awe factor.
Yeah.
In trying to understand, what we're now capable of doing. So tell us what you do.
Right, so why what we do is unique is because, there's been a lot of hype around organ printing. People have seen extrusion printing, cells being deposited in a dish. That doesn't create tissue that has circulation. There's a limit of oxygen diffusion that's about as thick as a piece of paper. And if you don't have blood vessels or capillaries that can perfuse oxygen there, it's a dead tissue. And so there's been a hype cycle around this where everyone's like, oh, we're going to 3D print organs and tissues. It's a massive roadblock. No one was able to solve this problem. And so that's why what we're doing is so unique, is that we can actually put those capillaries and blood vessels into tissue beds and start the process of oxygen perfusion.
And you talk about how much of an open door policy you
Yes.
have because it does seem so fantastical. Can you talk
Yeah,
to
we
me
were
a little
laughing
bit
about
that?
that earlier. If you wanted to imagine a Silicon Valley hype company, it would be one that laser prints organs, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, a nod to Theranos and the issues they had. We always have an open door policy around visiting our lab, seeing our tissues. We ship them to customers at this point who have their own microscopy techniques and can see that what we do is real. And so I think that's really important if you're starting a company, is to have, you know, a known level of transparency. Obviously, we have people sign NDAs if they're going to be deep in our technical world, but that's about it. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about now, like the heart of the conversation, which is, you know, how do we advance women in all levels of leadership in this field, but just generally in any field where that big risk is required.
Right.
And, you know, when I was reading about Melanie's story, I thought about what a unique vantage point she has because she's young, she's a woman, with a company, founded a company that's doing cutting edge technology in the tech center of the world. I mean, you couldn't really slice the population thinner than that. And so you're seeing things that we may not be seeing, both possibilities as well as warnings and challenges that could help all of us advance. You know, those people who don't know how to print tissues with machines, right?
Right. Well, pitching is hard. Raising funds is really, really hard. I made the choice with our company, and I don't know if everyone would want to do this. I bought a condo when I was in grad school. I sold it and bootstrapped all of my own patent filings so that when I showed up at the VC stores, I had something to show them. Yeah. I don't know if that's always necessary, but that's the way it worked for us. And so 100% ownership, here it is, yeah.
And, you know, and I try to avoid questions and so aware of questions that are only asked of women, right? So I don't want to ask you, like, what made you feel that you could do that? Because that's something that we do associate with men. Yeah. Is this kind of like, you know what, I'm going to bet the whole thing on this one number.
Right, right.
But so, where did that internal strength come from?
Well, I think it came down to me really having some time with the idea and thinking about it, and I realized, you know, if we could solve this one technological roadblock, the applications were massive for so many people, and it would be so meaningful not only in tissue transplantation, but things like drug discovery, where you can use 3D tissues and look at better architecture and different cell-cell interactions. So when I sat down and I thought about the magnitude of the problem this technology could solve, I actually felt responsibility to see this through. And so I think that was the impetus that pushed me over the edge and to take a big risk. Yeah. Also, there is something I'd like to share with everyone. Startups are actually less risky than you perceive. The number of skills you gain, the number of interactions you have with people, the networking opportunities, the fact that you show yourself as someone who is able to take a risk and do something intelligent and new, it's far less risky than we perceive. Even if the startup doesn't work, that's not necessarily failure. You've gained training that you would only get in a decade somewhere else.
It's such a positive way to really talk about it, because are you saying that even if it fails, is that
even
because
if
it fails then you are almost instantly more employable somewhere else?
Absolutely. And there are so many startups in this area just looking for good talent. People who have startup experience are immediately valuable.
And this is not, you know, to sort of diminish some of the risks that you've taken, but it has been really, really hard work.
Yes.
And, you know, you started in 2016, and you talk about just going into, you know, the roadshow to ask for funds, and how that feels for a young woman.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard other people, not just women, but men say raising a round of funding is one of the hardest things they've ever done in their lives. And so it's emotional. The VCs are there to vet you from head to toe, poke holes in you 6 ways from Sunday, to try to figure out what your Achilles heel is in your company. And so when you put your heart and soul into building this man or woman, that's actually really hard to go through for months. Yeah. And one thing that is unique and different, though, about women pitching, there was a Wall Street Journal article a couple of years ago where they said that men are more likely to ask female entrepreneurs how their company will fail and they're more likely to ask men to outline how their company will succeed. And that's an inherent bias. I experienced it at a couple firms. I had one firm actually, they were really excited, went through like 4 meetings, and then they asked me to write up basically a huge thing about how all the ways our company could fail. And I was so confused. And I asked my other friends in the business side, I was like, does this happen? Is this normal? Is this like some pre-vetting before due diligence? And they had never seen that.
Wow.
So this, this is something that is an inherent bias that I've encountered personally. Yeah.
So this is, what I find interesting in that as we're seeing more women in leadership roles, and we're seeing more people who are normally marginalized go into leadership roles. Do you think that what's the action there? Is the action that women are actually raising the bar, right? Because it's good to do pretty thorough vetting of these companies, or do we need to ask the men to act a little bit differently? Right. At the very least, if your standard is this low for a man, then maybe you need to bring my standard lower too. So where do you see that as an industry leader?
I think Rami's talk this morning was really good, where he talked about the hiring dynamics. If you have more than one woman in the hiring pool, you're likely to see it as less of a risk. And I would say that's probably actually the same in the investment pool. The VCs are basically hiring you to be a steward of that money and to turn it into something big. And so I would say not only having more women on the other side of the table as VCs, but having more women taking that risk and building a startup and building something they care about. I think that will help.
Another question would be, how would you change it when you're put in a position of power where you can actually begin to change the dynamics, especially as a CEO and a founder, where you actually have control over how you run your company and how you design the dynamics within your office. What do you find you're changing because of your particular experience?
So it's always hard to know how other people do things differently. But our company is 100% female management right now, actually. Wow. That wasn't necessarily on purpose. I was just hiring the best people that I could get. And so,
bravo, right?
Yeah, right. And so,
right?
And that's how it happened. And then about 50% of my scientists team is also female. And they're phenomenal. They work well with the men on the team. Everyone works well together. It's a big, happy team. And so...
Do you find your management?
Do you do that?
Yeah, your management style is different in a good way?
That's a really good question. So I would...
Or even better is maybe it doesn't even factor in the fact that you're a woman, which is sort of the ideal situation for us all, right?
I think that's kind of how I've approached it. I haven't thought of myself as a female manager. Unless someone's pointed it out to me and I'm like, oh, okay, sure. But I think naturally women tend to be more collaborative. They tend to be more focused on group and team dynamics. For our company in particular, that makes a big difference because in human tissue engineering, you have to have a cell biologist talking to an engineer, talking to a developmental biologist, and they all inherently speak, and a chemist, we have chemists on staff, all inherently speak different languages. And so to get them to collaborate is really critical to building something as complex as an organ.
Interesting. And this is where I always like to take the conversation again, because my intention is always for you, the audience, to take something away from it, right? To take something away from the conversation and bring it to your own little networks. And I always like to break it down with awareness, analysis, and action, right? So you walk away becoming aware of something that maybe you weren't aware of before. So, whether that is founding a company or being an industry leader, or even just changing office dynamics, what can you make us aware that is a challenge for women to advance in leadership roles?
Right. Being able to speak up and being heard, feeling competent, and confidence. And I think we chatted about this earlier. Just small little things like taking the seat at the head of a table. We were laughing at this. So we have an IP legal team that works with our company, and every time I go in that office, I sit at the head of the table. I'm paying them. But little things like that. You don't have to be terrible about it. You just smile and lean back, and you take a little more space up, and you're casual about it, and that actually works really well.
So are you used to doing that now? Because it's amazing that we still have to talk about that, right?
Right.
It happens to me too, where I feel like every time
There's a noticeable shift.
Yes, every time you take the head of the table, or you sit in the front row seat, I don't know about you, but I always go, oh, I'm sitting in the front row of this. Like, you know, I'm sitting here or I'm sitting at the head of the table.
Right.
And I imagine for people who are used to just being able to do that doesn't even cross their mind.
Right.
So it's easier for you now to sit at the head of the table.
Yeah, I think there's a little, I think I have a little bit of a rebellious streak in there. So I kind of like to do it and just do it.
Yes.
And I think that's important too. I don't think, anyone's going to throw you out of their office for sitting there. So yeah, do it. Just do it and see how far you can get with it.
And I'm really fascinated by, right? It's amazing that it's sometimes you're a little bit more self-conscious about it than everybody else in the room. I'm really fascinated by the whole road show because I think asking for money is one of the hardest things for women and women trying to found companies where they need a huge injection of cash.
Right.
So what have you learned in your experience from asking not just for some money, but really a lot of money to get your company going?
Right. So one of the things that's helpful if you have difficulty just saying, hey, I need $1 million, $7 million, $15 million, a lot of us aren't used to asking for those numbers from someone, is you have your budget outlined. You need to know how far you can take your company. And if you have those numbers in front of you and 20% of the time this might go wrong or we might lose an employee and need to hire someone again, and you can make all those contingency plans, that amount of money makes sense then. And you understand what you need to run your own company, and then that ask doesn't sound so big, and you have the numbers to back it up. Yeah.
And are you finding that you are going in feeling that you have to be more prepared than your counterparts or maybe your other male founders?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say it probably depends a little bit more on the VC. Some VCs grab an idea and they're like, go for it, right?
Yes.
And then we'll sort the numbers later. And then I think we do get drilled down a little bit more on the science, which is interesting because I was a trained scientist. I was doing this as a career for 15 years. And I'll never forget, I was pitching a company that is now going to fund our round. But they said to me, well, these guys at Harvard and MIT say they're doing something similar, blah, blah, blah. And I was so tired of pitching. It was like 4 months in. And I handed them a set of CAD files, which are basically drawings and designs. And I said, ask those guys if they can print what we print. Yes. And they came back a week later and offered us funding. So that was
I love it.
That was
it's
great.
Like the scientist, it's the scientist version of a mic drop, right?
I felt really good about it. I was also too tired to do much else because I'd been pitching for so long. But don't be afraid to do that mic drop. I actually learned that works really well. And before, I had been almost coddling them, like, okay, well, let me explain how the science works. So that's not what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear some sort of strength and confidence in that. Yeah.
I love that. You're right that we sort of don't know how to do different versions of mic drops depending on what we do for a living.
Right.
That we sort of have to just say, you know what? I'm worth it.
Yeah.
Right? So let's talk a little bit about analysis, and that's looking at the problem a little bit more closely, because I think sort of that's the privilege that we have in rooms like this and with conversations, is that we can actually sit back in a pretty comfortable situation and say, okay, let's take a deep breath and figure out why aren't we seeing more women start companies that are cutting edge and maybe are a little bit riskier. From your vantage point, why is this happening? Why is this a problem? And what are the challenges that we sort of need to begin addressing?
So I'm not sure why it's happening. I do know, I can maybe chat about some ideas there. I do know that women who do start companies these companies tend to be more successful on average than male-started companies. It may be that women have, by the time they decide to start the company, they've sussed out every potential risk and they are ready to go for it. Kind of like we have to make sure we check all the boxes in employment before we apply for the job, right?
Which I actually think is a good thing.
Yeah.
But we have to bring everybody to that standard, right?
Right.
And I think that's where women can really contribute, is that we always talk about, like, well, men don't have to do as much work.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they do now, and maybe they should.
Right. We need to raise the bar on them a little. The VC world is kind of fast and loose sometimes, so it's hard for me to comment exactly why more men would be starting companies. I think there's a bit of like an ego challenge there. It sounds like the cool thing to do. There are a lot more guys drawn to race car driving, kind of the same thing. It's really risky. It's really dangerous. Let me just go out there and do it. I think I would encourage everyone though to do it, because I don't think it's as risky as we perceive it to be.
And you said something really interesting when we were talking in the green room about sort of a lot of the unconscious bias that we hold. And, sometimes when you are face to face with somebody who doesn't look like you or is not familiar with you,
right, yeah.
You're less trusting almost immediately.
That's true, and that could be a reason why fewer women are getting the funding to start companies initially, is that most of the funding is controlled by male VCs still. And there have been some studies that have determined that people tend to trust other people with money if they look like them and if they can relate to them. And so building that relationship with the VC is incredibly important. And difficult.
Yes, and
there's a power dynamic,
Because you're really, that's what any woman who's in a leadership position now or starting companies where women before weren't starting companies is you're truly trailblazing. Whereas, it used to be that we build relationship on the golf course or over dinner and drinks. That has to begin to change.
Right. So new ways to build relationships with the people controlling the money. It's always important to go to networking events at the very least.
Are you finding that you're having to demand different ways to build that relationship? Like maybe I can't go on that plea. You mentioned another.
Right, yeah. A friend of mine who's also an entrepreneur, we pitched the same fund, and they were closer to investing in us than he ever got, but they invited him on like a plane trip to like Colorado, and we're like hanging out with him, and I don't even think we did dinner. It was very odd. So and that was a group of younger men who were controlling a fund, and I think there's this perceived fear of, okay, if I take her out to dinner, like maybe I've crossed a line, or they're just not sure how that falls, and I think that is a detriment to women. We have a bigger hurdle to get over there.
Any insight on the different alternatives that we can have so that we don't just have those options of like, are you going to go on my private plane? Are we going to go out for dinner? Those can't be the only relationship building tools that we have.
Yeah, there's lunch meetings, there's, I don't know, if you pick up a sport, if you like watching soccer, actually, anytime there's a lot of World Cup games that people get into, I like soccer, I used to play soccer, but I think you have to just look for common ground and build from there. Just find something.
And still, talking about the action part of this conversation, can you give us some insight into the people who supported you, that allowed you to take those risks and allowed you to build your company when maybe you only had a few tools available to you?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been fortunate to have a few mentors in my life that have been phenomenal. I think sometimes the best mentors end up picking you instead of you seeking them out, because they're experienced, they know what's a good fit, they enjoy being a mentor. One thing about that, though, I would say is that not everyone in a mentorship role is a good mentor. And so I've had bosses who I would not peg as being the most female-friendly.
Really?
And so I think, picking and choosing your mentors as you go, recognizing that, and not trying to change them, but work around them, find the people who will be your champion, and move forward that way.
And did you feel like I sort of identify as a storyteller, and I'm always thinking about narratives, and that there are sometimes narratives that hurt us and narratives that help us. Did you find that talking about your story as a woman, as a young person, was that something that helped you, or did you eventually want that to go away so that what was left was your knowledge and your expertise?
Right. I think that actually has some roots in the imposter syndrome for me. So as a scientist, I would rely on my knowledge and expertise. I am undeniably good at this. No one can stop me. It doesn't matter who I am, man, woman, whatever. But I think when I look back at some of this stuff, that was really part of my story. It did affect things. There were choices I had to make. People I had to ignore when they said, oh, you're not good enough for this chemistry class. I'm like, well, okay, I guess I'll fail. Here I come.
Or I'll build a company that prints tissues and machines.
Yeah, exactly. So,
it's like scientist mic drop.
No, but yeah, I think sometimes I, kind of rely on, I am a good scientist, and I kind of pep talk myself on that. But, all the struggles of being a woman, trying to find the best mentors, going through that, it's important to recognize as part of this journey as well.
And that's where I sort of wanted to leave the audience with some inspiration from your own journey and sort of the best advice that you can give for people who are maybe not wanting to print tissues and organs, but wanting to do something equally risky and act on that big idea?
Yeah, I would say if it's an idea that you've had on the shelf and it keeps coming back to you, there's something there. Pay attention to that, and don't be afraid, be fearless. And there are so many people, man and woman, who you can walk in a room and if you're fearless, they will listen to you. Whether they want to or not, they will sit there and listen. So so try that out. Try it in, your personal life, your professional life, it works. And chase down that idea.
And I want to, to use like a science metaphor, examine that a little bit more with a microscope, because I love that advice of be fearless. And I think anybody who likes to read advice books or, watch any videos that kind of motivate you, you're like, okay, good, I'm going to be fearless. I'm going to walk out the store, and then you come across a situation, you're like, oh God. So how do you,
I can give an example?
Yeah,
okay.
Please. Like,
right.
How do you develop that fearlessness? Because I'm sure it's something that grows over time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit of indignation when someone. So I had an example where we had someone I worked with in the science fields, and we'd be sitting around a table, and he would do the classic thing where I had said an idea, and he would paraphrase it, and then everyone would look at him, right? So that happened so many times that I decided there was this, you could ignore it, but I decided every time he said that, I would just start calling him out, and I did, and I said, oh, Mark, that's funny, that's the thing I just said. And like this happened a few times, and then it stopped happening. And so all of us can do that. And if you do it in a really nice way, it's actually perceived not so terribly. You're not perceived as being this like angry person. You're just like, oh, that's so funny. I think I just said that. You can make it a joke a little, but
was there
identify it.
Did it just happen too often that you finally said, okay, you know what? I'm going to finally say something. Like, what was the breaking point?
Yeah, I think, I was at a point in my career where I was starting to build my career a little, and I felt like I had some novel and unique ideas, and I just wanted the credit. Yeah.
And sometimes it's as simple as that, right? It's the ability to point out a challenge even before having the answers to the challenge. Because I think sometimes we don't want to say something is wrong until we know how to fix it, which is really like unrealistic pressure for anybody, right?
Yeah. But identifying what's going on around you, if you do it in a way where you just shine a light on it, it works. Yeah.
And moving forward into the future, what are some of the challenges that you see? It's so obvious how many hurdles you've overcome to build this company. Is there anything in the horizon that you feel, ooh, I know that's a challenge that I'm going to need help with, and that's another, learning or growth opportunity, which always sounds great when we put it that way, by the way, like a growth opportunity. But when you're going through it, it's very difficult.
Yeah, every growth opportunity is incredibly painful, by the way. I think in founding a company, coming from the academic world, and I'm 2.5 years in now, so I don't have a long history to speak to, but every day has been different. I've learned something new. The challenges of what it means to be a manager, the challenges of developing what we hope will be a global technology. That's my goal. Yeah. So, I help from anywhere at any time. If anyone has advice they want to send me, please. I won't turn it down. I may filter it, but that's about it. Yeah.
And one of the interesting questions that your friend posed to you, which I sort of want to wrap this talk up with that, is what would the world look like if your company succeeded, if you realized your vision? Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Jen, asked me this question before I started the company. What's this vision and what's the world going to look like? And I think that longer multi-generational families, longer, healthier lives, the world will be a stable place. The world will have great-grandparents you can ask questions. And I'm really looking forward to that day.
And my own personal follow-up to that question is, what would the world look like for other women if you succeeded? Because I think, I'm from Toronto and moved to the Bay Area last year, and I think it's so easy to take for granted just the access to knowledge and technology that we have here. And we think, oh, it's normal. I was teasing you that, for you, it's like, everybody has a PhD, right? Everybody has a PhD, which is really not the case. Yeah. And so what you're doing is something very special. And the fact that it's you who's doing it is very special. What do you think that looks like for other women, down the road who's closely watching your journey?
Yeah, I think, the more women we get into leadership roles, starting companies, doing interesting things in the public eye, the more we normalize this for everyone, and the more it just becomes the status quo.
Yeah. And there was particular things about your experience that felt like, ooh, people were like, ooh, that's different. Oh, that's not what I normally see. She's not what.
Oh,
Did you
yeah,
definitely have
I
that?
think there's been more than one time when people walked in the room and I haven't been identified as the lead scientist.
Yeah.
So, that's you know what? It's fine. You shine a light on it and you move forward. Yeah.
Just shrug it off.
Yeah.
Which is an experience almost every woman has ever had.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, are you the person that's supposed to take notes? Which is very old-fashioned.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I want to open up the floor for questions.
You have very strong scientific background.
Thank you.
So in growing your company, how do you go about vetting and recruiting people in other functional area in which you don't have direct experience? I ask that because I find that's a very challenging when I want to grow my company. Like
Right.
For
How
example,
do you assess
people
someone's
in
experience if it's not your
finance?
field?
You don't have direct experience. How do you find the right people?
Yeah, so that's where I will lean on their recommendations a little more. But something I have to say about hiring, which is a total hack that I learned, and it's so true because we have this amazing team right now, and I feel very lucky. You're not hiring for skill set number one. That's like number 3 or 4 on your list. You're hiring for someone who is resilient, who wants to learn, who is energetic, who is aligned with your vision and motivated. And you're hiring for that person. You're not going to hire for some jerk who has all the skills checked off. So look for those things first, and then I would say after that, you look at their experience. You talk to all of the references they offer. If you can find a reference or someone in your network who's worked with them that they didn't offer, that's even more valuable. And then that's how I go about that. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Wanji. I just have a question based off of something you said earlier. So you said that someone asked you to make a list of all the ways that your company would fail. Right. How did you respond to that? Because I didn't hear that.
Well, not knowing that wasn't normal and being really excited about this firm, I did that. I did the work. I think how I would respond today is I would say it sounds like we need to have another sit-down meeting. It sounds like you guys might be confused or have some questions I haven't fully addressed. And I would sit down face-to-face and address those questions. And the other thing I would do is I would start to try to shift it to their ideal investment, which is the guy who walks in with the laser printing of organs, right? And doesn't get deeply questioned on their scientific background. No, but I would shift that conversation to, okay, this is also how we're going to succeed. So let's address your questions here, but let me reiterate the success path.
Thank you.
Do you find it a personal mission now to sort of flag every time you're being treated differently?
I try
for whatever
not to.
aspect. It sounds like I like it.
Yeah. I think I try not to because I think it would get distracting.
Yeah.
But I do notice it a little more now. Yeah.
You said finding VCs is very difficult. Can you elaborate, like, what was your process like, or did you have already network in place that made it, how to connect? Because a lot of people who kind of transition to that don't even have a nearest clue of how to get started there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of really good accelerators in the Bay Area. 500 Startups is one. Y Combinator is another good one. We went through the Indie Bio program. They brought us in, and they had a network of established VCs that they brought us in to meet. They started to introduce us to their VCs. And the more you talk about what you do, if you really have a good vision and you're inspired, people will say, oh, well, I think I know someone who might be interested. And then that network will start to spread. And every pitch you do, you meet another couple VCs, and the message starts to spread. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, I think we're good. Is there any sort of final words or final pieces of advice that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I just want to say it's been a phenomenal day for me, watching all of you speak and meeting so many incredible women in one room. So thank you all for being here.
Yeah. And I thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you, everybody.